The story of Gideon is one of the most surprising and inspiring in the Bible. Amid the oppression of the Midianites, God chose an ordinary man, full of doubts and fears, to lead Israel in one of the most extraordinary victories. Gideon, who saw himself as the smallest in his house, was called by God to show that true strength does not come from human power, but from trust in the Lord. His story shows us that God uses the weak to confuse the strong, and also reveals the dangers of idolatry and ambition, bringing important lessons about faith, humility, and obedience. Gideon was born in a time of great suffering for Israel. The Midianites, a cruel and merciless people, plundered the Israelites' lands year after year, destroying crops and taking what little was left. The Israelites hid in mountain caves, terrified, as they watched their crops, livestock, and even their families being destroyed or taken away. The scenario was one of total despair. Gideon lived in Ophrah, a small village among the tribe of Manasseh. He was the son of Joash, and like many Israelites at that time, he could barely imagine how the lives of his people could change. He was a simple man, someone who would never stand out among the warriors of his tribe, nor would he have imagined that he could lead an army. He was not seen as a leader. In fact, Gideon saw himself as the smallest in his family, and his family as the least important of all. The oppression of the Midianites had broken the spirit of God's people. But even amid the chaos and fear, something surprising was about to happen. Israel's situation had reached an unbearable point, and the help they were hoping for would not come from a strong army or a powerful king. No, help would come from an unlikely place, from someone who, until that moment, was nothing more than a hidden and scared farmer. One day, while Gideon was kneading the wheat in the winepress, hidden from the Midianites, something extraordinary happened. He was alone, tending to what little was left of the harvest, trying to make sure his family had food. Fear of enemies made him act cautiously, and every sound in the wind kept him alert. It was at this moment of tension that an unexpected figure appeared. A man, at first glance common, but who Gideon would soon realize was different. This man, who was actually an angel sent by God, approached and, with a calm and firm voice, greeted Gideon in a surprising way. "The Lord is with you, mighty man." Those words sounded strange to Gideon. Brave, he who was hiding there out of fear of the Midianites, he who never wielded a sword in battle. Gideon, suspicious, immediately questioned, "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are the wonders that our fathers told us about?" The suffering of his people was clear, and Gideon could not understand how he could help. But the angel was direct. "Use the strength you have and free Israel from the hands of the Midianites." But Gideon hesitated. Despite the angel's words, Gideon was still full of doubts. He knew that he came from the smallest family in his tribe and did not have the confidence to lead anyone, and that the calling was too great for such a simple man. Before taking any step, he needed certainty. So, in a mixture of caution and fear, he asked the Lord for a sign. Gideon prepared a kid and unleavened bread, placed them on a rock, and waited. The angel extended his staff, and in the blink of an eye, fire rose from the rock, consuming the offering. Gideon was stunned, his legs shook, and he knew he had truly seen God's messenger. But the task would not be easy. That same night, God gave Gideon a direct order to destroy the altar of Baal that his own father had erected and to cut down the idol of Asherah. Idolatry had spread among the people, and this was the first step towards Israel's liberation. Gideon, still fearful, did as the Lord commanded, but under cover of darkness. He knew that at dawn the people would not be happy. The next morning, the city was in an uproar. The men soon discovered that Gideon had destroyed the altar and demanded his death. However, Joash, Gideon's father, took an unexpected step. "If Baal is God, let him fight for himself." These words protected Gideon, but now everyone knew him. His name was on every mouth, and eyes were upon him. Still, Gideon was not ready. He needed another sign to strengthen his faith. Having decided, he placed a woolen fleece on the ground and asked that at dawn there would be dew only on the wool and not on the land around it. That night, Gideon placed the fleece on the ground and went to sleep, waiting for the sign that would prove once again that God was with him. At dawn, his heart was pounding as he approached. When he touched the veil, he felt his wool completely soaked with dew, but the ground around him was dry. Without a doubt, it was a divine sign. Still, Gideon hesitated. What if it was a coincidence? Maybe it would be better to test it one more time just to be sure. Then he asked for another sign, this time that the fleece remained dry while the ground around it remained wet with dew. The next morning, when he approached the fleece, the ground was covered with dewdrops, but the wool remained dry. It was the confirmation he needed. God had truly chosen him for an impossible mission to free Israel from the hands of the Midianites. With renewed faith, Gideon gathered a large army, men from different tribes, ready to fight against the enemies that oppressed them. The camp of soldiers grew, and the impressive number of warriors brought a sense of security, even against the immense Midianite army that waited in the valley. It seemed like things were starting to fall into place. Gideon was beginning to feel that perhaps he could truly lead his people to victory. Gideon was about to face a gigantic army, and the relief of seeing so many men ready to fight at his side brought him a rare moment of confidence. After all, with 32,000 soldiers, the chances of victory seemed much more real. But that feeling was short-lived. God had other plans, and surprised him with an order that was difficult to understand. "There are too many people," said the Lord. He did not want Israel to boast of a victory by the strength of their numbers, but that recognized that salvation would come exclusively from his hand. Gideon, surprised, obeyed. God instructed him to tell the men that whoever was afraid could leave. He could hardly believe it when he saw the first group of men scatter. Little by little, thousands began to leave the camp. In the end, 22,000 men left, and Gideon was left with only 10,000. By now, he could already feel the weight of the mission increasing, but no matter how difficult it was, he knew he couldn't go back. And as if that wasn't scary enough, God spoke again. "There are still many." Gideon could hardly believe what he was hearing. The Lord asked him to take the men to the stream and watch as they drank water. Those who drank like dogs, licking the water with their tongues, would be chosen. And when Gideon finished watching, there were only 300 men left. It was too small a number, unimaginable. However, it was exactly what God wanted. With only 300 men at his side, Gideon knew that winning the battle against the Midianites seemed impossible to human eyes. But God had promised that he would deliver the enemy into the hands of Israel. Now, everything depended on following divine instructions to the letter. And the strategy that the Lord revealed to Gideon did not involve swords, spears, or bows. It was something completely unexpected. God gave Gideon a clear order. Each man should carry a trumpet, a torch hidden inside a clay pot, and at the right time, everyone should break the pots, light the torches, and blow the trumpets. This unusual tactic made no military sense, but Gideon trusted what God had said. Even though his men didn't fully understand the plan, they were all ready to comply. In the dead of night, the 300 men positioned themselves around the Midianite camp. The silence in the air was heavy, filled with tension. The enemies, not realizing that they were surrounded, slept in their tents, completely unprepared for what was to come. At the right moment, Gideon gave the signal. In an instant, the sound of trumpets echoed across the mountains, torches flashed in the dark, and clay pots were broken, creating a deafening noise. Confusion engulfed the enemy camp. Waking up in the midst of chaos, the Midianites could not distinguish who was friend and who was enemy. Desperate, they began to fight each other, and what seemed like an invincible force began to disintegrate. The chaos that took over the Midianite camp was devastating. Gideon and his 300 men barely had to fight. In the midst of darkness, the Midianites, seized by panic, began to attack each other. The confusion was so great that every man seemed like an enemy, and the vast army crumbled. Men fell over each other, fleeing in despair in the night. It was clear that God had fulfilled his promise to deliver the enemies into Gideon's hands. But the victory was not yet complete. Many of the Midianites managed to flee, including their leaders, Zebah and Zalmunna. And Gideon knew that as long as these leaders remained alive, the threat to Israel would continue. So, without hesitation, he and his men set out in pursuit, even though they were exhausted after the battle. Gideon does not, "I would rest," until the mission was complete. During the persecution, Gideon asked the men of Succoth and Penuel for help, but they, incredulous that Gideon would be able to defeat Zebah and Zalmunna, refused to support the Israelites. This rejection, however, did not shake Gideon's determination. With courage, he continued to follow the trails of the two enemy kings, taking with him the few men he had left. Each step of this hunt required more strength and faith. Gideon knew he was outnumbered and his army was tired, but the end of Israel's oppression was near, and he couldn't go back. The fate of the enemy leaders was sealed, and Gideon approached them every moment. Gideon's persecution was not easy. He and his 300 men were exhausted. They had already fought, ran, and chased their enemies for miles, but Gideon's determination was unshakable. Complete victory would only come with the capture of the Midianite leaders, Zebah and Zalmunna. They were the head of the serpent, and Gideon knew that as long as they were alive, the threat to Israel persisted. Hunger and tiredness did not stop him from moving forward. Gideon and his men advanced through the desert until they finally surrounded the camp of the fleeing kings. It was the decisive moment. With a quick and precise strategy, Gideon's few men surprised the soldiers protecting Zebah and Zalmunna. Amid the attack, the king's army fell apart once again, and finally they were captured. With Zebah and Zalmunna under his control, Gideon started back. His mind, however, was not only on the kings who now stood before him. He had not forgotten the scorn he suffered in Succoth and Penuel, where local leaders refused to help him in his mission. Now, with the enemy kings as prisoners, he would return to those cities to settle the score. When he arrived at Succoth, Gideon showed the captured kings to the unbelieving leaders. His victory was proof that God was on his side all along, and those who despised him would now pay the price for their distrust. Gideon's victory over the Midianites brought peace to Israel for the first time in many years. The people, relieved by the end of the oppression, he couldn't believe that this man, previously unknown, had become the liberator of his nation. The Israelites were euphoric, grateful to finally be free from the enemy. It was a time of celebration, but also of important decisions for the future. As Gideon returned with the captured kings and his small troop, a crowd began to gather around him. What were initially murmurs of thanks soon turned into something bigger. The people began to cheer Gideon as the great hero of Israel, and amidst the emotion, an unexpected proposal emerged. "Gideon, be our king," they said. "Rule over us, you, your children, and your children's children." The offer was tempting. After all, Gideon had restored peace in a time of chaos and despair. The people saw in him the leadership they so longed for. However, to the surprise of many, Gideon refused. He stood firm, reminding the people that true victory came from God, and that only the Lord should rule over Israel. "I will not reign over you, nor will my son reign," he said. "The Lord is the one who will reign over you." Despite refusing the throne, Gideon made a request. He asked each man to give him a gold earring from the remains of the war. Gideon's request seemed harmless. He just wanted some of the gold that had been taken from the Midianites. With the earrings that each man gave him, Gideon had an ephod made, an object of symbolic value, intended to represent the presence of God in Israel. Initially, it was supposed to be a memorial, something that would remind the people of the victory that God had granted them. However, things did not turn out as he imagined. The ephod, made of shining gold, became a centerpiece in Ophrah, Gideon's hometown. Soon, people from all parts of Israel began to visit the site, not only to remember the great victory, but to worship. The ephod, which should be a symbol of faith, began to be treated as an object of worship. Without Gideon realizing it, he had created a new trap for God's people. Israel, so easily led astray, began to fall back into idolatry. The ephod became a distraction, taking the focus away from the true worship of the Lord. Gideon, who had led one of the greatest victories in Israel's history, now saw his own people stumbling before an object that he himself had created. Gideon lived for many years after his victory over the Midianites. During this time, Israel enjoyed a peace it had not experienced in a long time. The people respected Gideon and remembered how God had used him to free them. He had many children, and his life seemed peaceful in Ophrah. Gideon was undoubtedly one of Israel's greatest judges, but his time on earth was coming to an end. With his death, something quickly began to change. The absence of his leadership opened space for the old problem that always surrounded Israel: idolatry. The golden ephod, which he had ordered made, continued to be a stumbling block for the people. Without Gideon to guide them, the hearts of the Israelites turned once again to false gods. The cycle of disobedience, which seemed to have been interrupted, soon returned with force. However, idolatry was not the only problem that arose. One of Gideon's sons, Abimelech, saw an opportunity to take power for himself. Unlike his father, who refused to be king, Abimelech did not share the same humility. Ambitious and unscrupulous, he began to devise a plan to become the ruler of Israel. Abimelech did not care about the worship of God or true justice. His only goal was the throne. And to achieve this, he was willing to do the unthinkable. Gideon's death left a void that his son intended to fill. But the path Abimelech would choose would be marked by blood and betrayal. Abimelech, son of Gideon, soon showed himself to be a very different man from his father. Driven by ambition and desire for power, he spared no effort to achieve his goal. Instead of being a leader guided by faith and the fear of God, Abimelech decided to take the throne by force. And in a shocking act, he went to his brothers, the sons of Gideon, and mercilessly killed them, all except Jotham, who managed to escape. This massacre was a brutal attempt to eliminate any competitor for power. With his brothers dead, Abimelech proclaimed himself king in Shechem, but his reign was marked by violence and a lack of justice. He ruled with an iron fist, and the people soon found themselves in a new cycle of suffering, very different from the peace they had experienced during Gideon's lifetime. Abimelech, who was supposed to honor his father's legacy, became the oppressor that Gideon fought so hard to defeat. However, Abimelech's ambition also led to his downfall. His government was short and full of conflicts. Eventually, he faced a rebellion, and in one of the battles, when trying to take a city, he was hit in the head by a stone thrown by a woman. Wounded and humiliated, he asked one of his soldiers to kill him with a sword so that it would not be said that a woman had taken his life. And so Abimelech's reign ended, a tragic end for a man who had everything to honor his father's name, but chose the path of greed and destruction. The peace that Gideon had won quickly fell apart, and Israel returned to the cycle of idolatry and chaos. Gideon's story is marked by impressive twists and turns, showing that God chooses those who, to human eyes, seem insignificant to accomplish great things. Gideon started out as an ordinary man, hidden, full of doubts and insecurities. However, it was precisely this weakness that God used to demonstrate his power. The victory over the Midianites was not achieved by strength or the number of soldiers, but by obedience to God, who made it clear that it is He who grants victory, even in the most unlikely situations. Gideon's journey teaches us about faith. Despite his doubts, he took courageous steps, trusting in the signs God sent him. His willingness to follow divine guidance, even when everything seemed impossible, shows how much trust in God can transform the impossible into reality. Gideon led a small troop of 300 men against a vast army and still triumphed. But Gideon's story also brings important warnings. After his great victory, the golden ephod, created with good intentions, became a bond of idolatry for Israel. Even the most faithful leaders can unintentionally cause their people to stumble when they lose focus on what really matters: faithfulness to God. Ultimately, Gideon's legacy fell apart due to the ambition of his son Abimelech, who used his power for evil. The story warns us about the dangers of vanity and a thirst for control, reminding us that without God, even the greatest triumphs can crumble. Gideon's greatest lesson is clear. When we put our trust in God, He does the impossible. But we can never forget that all glory belongs to Him and not to man. If you liked Gideon's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.